The dawn came heavy, the kind that clung to the skin and lungs with the wet weight of Louisiana air. Mist rose from the bayou and drifted over the cane fields, carrying the scent of rot and damp earth. A crow screamed from the branch of a cypress tree, its black wings slicing the sky before settling again in silence. In the slave quarters, the rustle of straw pallets gave way to the groan of tired bodies. Sarah stirred, her back stiff, her wrists aching from the day before. The scars on her shoulders throbbed as if they had memory of the whip. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Ruth. The young girl curled beside her, clinging even in sleep. Ruth's breath was shallow, her ribs pressing through skin no more than a bird caught in a storm. The horn sounded. A single, sharp note. It meant one thing: time to work. Sarah pulled herself to her feet. The floor beneath her was dirt, hard-packed and cool. Around her, the others moved with the same quiet resignation, men with bowed backs. Women with hollow eyes, children old enough to carry baskets, though still small enough to cry when they thought no one could hear. The overseers didn't tolerate crying. Sarah tied her headscarf, the cloth frayed from years of use. Her dress, little more than a sack with seams, hung loose where it once clung. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she swallowed it down. Hunger was a constant companion, as steady as the sun that rose each morning to beat them into the earth. Outside, the overseer Harlan waited on horseback, whip coiled in his hand like a living snake. His face was sharp, his eyes colder than steel. "Move, cattle," he barked. His voice carried across the quarters, slicing through the morning fog. They filed out, heads down, feet dragging through the mud. Sarah walked in silence, but her eyes, dark and steady, flicked once toward Moses. The old man bent nearly double beside her. His beard was gray, his hands twisted from years at the forge back in Virginia before they sold him south. He gave Sarah the faintest nod, an acknowledgement that needed no words. They had both survived another night. The cane fields stretched before them like an endless punishment. Tall stalks swayed in the early breeze, their blades sharp enough to cut skin. The work was brutal, hacking, carrying, binding. The air filled with dust and sweat until it choked the lungs. Sarah's hands found the handle of her machete, rough wood smoothed by years of grip. She swung with rhythm, chop after chop, each stroke pulling more from her body than it gave back. The overseer rode among them, shouting when someone slowed, cracking the whip when he wanted to remind them what pain felt like. The sound of it split the morning, a hiss, then the crack, then the silence after a scream. By midday, sweat drenched Sarah's dress, stinging her lashes. Her arms trembled with the effort to lift, cut, bind. But she kept moving. Stopping meant pain. Stopping meant Harlan. At the break, they were given cornmeal mush in wooden troughs. Sarah scooped her portion, swallowed quickly, and gave part of hers to Ruth, who had stumbled twice in the fields already. Ruth ate with trembling hands, whispering a thank you to Soft for anyone but Sarah to hear. As they rested, Sarah let her eyes wander across the plantation. Beyond the canes stretched the big house-white columns rising like a monument, its windows reflecting sunlight like watchful eyes. It was a different world up there, one of fine dresses, polished floors, and laughter that came from full stomachs and drunken cards. She had been inside only once, ordered to scrub the floors after a poker night left them sticky with spilled whiskey. She remembered the stink of cigar smoke, the sound of men's laughter, and the way they threw coins on the table as if wealth meant nothing. To them, wealth was measured not in coin, but in bodies like hers. A lash cut through her thoughts. A man screamed as the whip landed again and again. Sarah forced her face blank, eyes lowered. Witnessing meant nothing but danger, but in her chest, the ember of anger burned. When the sun finally dipped low and the fields turned golden, they were marched back to the quarters. Sarah's muscles ached so deep she wondered if she would ever feel rest again. The night air hummed with crickets, and the cypress trees loomed like silent guards. Inside the quarters, the slaves murmured softly, voices low enough not to reach overseer ears. Ruth leaned against Sarah, eyes half closed. Moses rubbed his ruined hands and whispered a prayer. Words that sounded older than the soil beneath them. Sarah lay back on her pallet of straw. staring at the cracks in the roof where stars peeked through. Her body begged for sleep, but her mind wandered to memories her mother's song, her father's hammer ringing in Virginia's forge, the laughter of siblings she hadn't seen since the day they tore her from them. She clung to those scraps, because without them, she was nothing but flesh for another man's profit. The whip had scarred her body. The chains had tried to bend her. But deep inside, beneath the cypress and the silence, but tomorrow she would endure again. For now in the dark, she let herself whisper the song her mother once sang. Too soft for even Ruth to hear. A song of freedom she dared not speak, but would never let die. Asterisk, the plantation did not sleep the way Freeman's land did. Even when night fell, and the cane fields vanished into shadow, the world of the enslaved pulsed with restlessness. Bodies shifted on pallets of straw, whispers moved like moths through the dark, and fear lingered long after the overseer's footsteps faded. That evening, Sarah sat near the doorway of the quarters, her arms wrapped around her knees. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, the faint bitterness of cornmeal still clinging to her tongue. Ruth curled beside her, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. Moses sat across the room, his voice low as he recited a prayer. Loud, brash, careless laughter that spilled into the night. Men's voices rose and fell, mixed with the clinking of glasses, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of cards. Sarah knew the sound too well. It was the master's game. Colonel Elias Whitmore, owner of 200 acres of cane, was a man of refinement in public, cruelty in private. His neighbors praised his hospitality, his elegant suits imported from New Orleans, his fine brandy, but the enslaved knew him by the flash of his cane across a man's face. By the way he gambled away lives as easily as coin. The poker table was his altar. On it debts were made, fortunes shifted, and human beings were reduced to chips. Sarah had once seen him bet 2 slaves against another man's thoroughbred horse. He won the horse, sold the slaves south, and bragged about the profit for weeks. That night, as the cards turned in the big house, the quarter sat in silence. Each burst of laughter carried a threat. Sometimes, when Whitmore lost, his rage poured into the fields the next day, his whip cracking harder. His overseers ordered to double the punishments. Other nights when he won, his cruelty softened only slightly, replaced with a different kind of danger, drunken amusement. That made him toy with his property like a cat with a mouse. Sarah listened with clenched jaw. She hated that laughter, hated the way it reminded her that she and the others were pawns in his game. But hatred had no place on her face. Hatred meant death. The next morning came with the same horn, the same fields, the same heat that burned the skin raw. Sarah forced her body into rhythm, swinging the machete, binding stalks, carrying bundles until her muscles screamed. The sun rose higher, unrelenting. Sweat blurred her vision, and her hands slipped on the handle of her blade. She stumbled. Just once, the bundle slipped from her grip and thudded against the ground. Pick it up. Overseer Harlan's voice sliced through the air. Sarah bent, grasping the cane. Her arms shook. She lifted it again, but too slowly. The whip cracked. The pain ripped across her back, fire blooming beneath her skin. She gasped, but did not cry out. Again, Harlan shouted, his voice thick with satisfaction. Another lash tore into her flesh. This time, she staggered forward, the bundle clutched tight. Around her, the field had gone silent. Other slaves worked with frantic desperation, eyes averted. No one dared look at her, but Sarah felt their hearts beating with hers. Harlan wheeled his horse closer, glaring down at her. Stand up straight, wench. Show them what happens when you slow the work. Blood trickled beneath her dress, soaking into the cloth. Her body shook, but her chin did not fall. For a long moment, their eyes locked. His whip hung ready, waiting for her to plead, to beg, to break. But Sarah said nothing. The silence enraged him more than screams ever could. With a final lash, he spat in the dirt and turned his horse away. Keep moving. Sarah's body burned, but she forced herself back into rhythm. Each swing of the machete sent pain screaming down her spine, but she moved anyway. Not for Harlan, not for Whitmore, but for herself. Refusal to collapse was the only defiance she could afford. That night, the laughter rose again from the big house. Sarah lay on her pallet, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, her back sticky with blood. Ruth wept quietly beside her, clutching her hand. "You should have begged," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling. He might have stopped. Sarah turned her head slowly, her eyes steady. "And then what? Tomorrow, he'd want it again. Better he knows I won't give him that." Ruth pressed her face into Sarah's arm, sobbing. Moses, from the far side of the room, muttered, "Child, you've got fire in you, but fire burns the hand that holds it." Sarah closed her eyes. She thought of Whitmore at his table, his cards shuffling, his laughter echoing. She thought of Harlan's whip. The crack still ringing in her ears, her body trembled with exhaustion. But deep inside, the ember glowed brighter. The whip had not broken her. The cards had not erased her. She was still here, and as long as she drew breath, something inside her remained untouchable. The morning fog clung low across the fields, curling around the stalks of cane like smoke. Sarah's body ached from the lashes she had endured the day before, the welts raw and tender beneath her ragged dress. Each step into the fields reopened them, but she carried herself steady, her jaw set, her face blank. Work dulled the hours. The chop of machetes, the hiss of cane blades, the shuffle of bare feet dragging through mud, these sounds blended into a rhythm of suffering. But while her body worked, Sarah's mind drifted back to Virginia. To the world she had lost. She had been 13 when they tore her away. She still remembered the red clay soil of her home, the forge where her father's hammer rang steady as a heartbeat. His arms had been strong, his voice deep when he sang hymns that carried through the quarters. Her mother braided her hair by firelight, humming stories from long before Sarah was born. She remembered laughter to her younger brother chasing chickens in the yard, her sister carrying a baby doll made of rags. Those memories had burned into her, etched so deep that even whips could not scour them away. But the day they came to take her was the day the world cracked. She remembered the trader's wagon, the clink of chains, her mother's screams, high, broken animal. She remembered the way her father's voice broke when he called her name. The sound cut short when the butt of a rifle struck him. Sarah had reached for them, but rough hands dragged her back, her wrists bound. Her body thrown in among others who had also been stolen. They called it sold south. The words were simple, clean, but the reality was filth and blood and endless sorrow. Sarah had been packed with dozens of others, carted down roads she did not know, forced onto boats where the stench of bodies and sickness clung to every plank. By the time she reached Louisiana, she was not a daughter or a sister anymore. She was property, a line on a ledger, lot to be inspected like cattle. The overseer's voice dragged her back to the present. Move faster. Harlan's whip snapped at the air, a sound that made Sarah's stomach clench even before it touched skin. A boy near her faltered, too small to carry his bundle. The lash found him before he could cry out. His scream pierced the field, but Harlan did not slow. He relished the fear. Sarah forced her eyes away, though the boy's cry cut her deeper than the whip had. By midday they were given scraps cornmeal, beans boiled in pork fat, ladled into rough bowls. Sarah chewed slowly, her stomach still twisting with hunger even after the last bite. Around her, others ate in silence, their faces gaunt, their bodies worn. Clothing hung in tatters, dresses patched again and again, trousers that barely covered knees, headscarves stained with sweat and dirt. In the evenings, after work, the quarters filled with murmurs. Some prayed. Some told stories, scraps of hope pieced together from memory. That night, Moses leaned close to Sarah as the others dozed. His eyes, clouded with age, still carried the weight of wisdom. "They can own your back. Girl," he whispered, "but not your soul. Remember that. It's the only freedom they can't sell." Sarah listened, the words soaking into her like water into dry earth. Her body was weary, her spirit battered, but Moses's words kindled something. She remembered her father's voice, saying almost the same thing once. Long ago, lying on her pallet, She closed her eyes and held her memories close. She would not let them fade. Not the hammer's rhythm. Not her mother's lullabies. Not the laughter of her brother and sister. The overseers could whip her, starve her, grind her into the soil, but they could not erase the ashes of the past that glowed in her chest. And as long as those ashes glowed, there was still something inside her that no master could touch. Asterisk, the bathhouse sat on the far edge of the big house yard. A whitewashed wooden building with narrow windows and a roof that slanted low against the trees. To the planter's guests, it was a sign of refinement, proof that Colonel Whitmore's estate had all the luxuries of New Orleans. But to the enslaved, it was a place of dread. Its walls had heard too many screams. Its floor had been scrubbed too many times of blood, vomit, and tears. Sarah had been sent there before, always at night. Always after the Colonel's card games, when the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke still clung to his clothes. She was ordered to scrub his garments in steaming tubs until her fingers wrinkled and raw skin burned from lye soap. The bathhouse was dim, the lantern light casting long shadows that moved with every drip of water. To Sarah, it felt less like a place of cleansing and more like a chamber where dignity was stripped away, one lash at a time. One evening, Ruth was taken there. She had faltered in the fields, her small body giving out under the weight of cane stalks twice her size. Harlan had dragged her by the arm, ignoring her cries, and delivered her to the Colonel with the mocking words, "Here's one who needs reminding." Sarah and the others waited in the quarters, ears straining. At first came muffled voices, then a scream, high, piercing, and cut short. Another followed, weaker, then silence. Hours passed. When Ruth returned, her body sagged against Sarah's chest, her face gray, her eyes empty as if the soul inside had retreated somewhere unreachable. Sarah stroked her hair, whispering, "You're here, you're safe," though she knew neither word was true. The bathhouse was never spoken of openly, but its presence hung over the quarters like a storm cloud. Men stared at the ground when it was mentioned. Mothers pulled children closer. And even Moses's voice faltered when prayers touched on deliverance. Everyone knew the bathhouse was not only for washing, it was for breaking. Another night Sarah was sent again. She carried the Colonel's sweat-soaked garments, her hands shaking, though her face remained still. The bathhouse door creaked open, the smell of damp wood and lye striking her nose. Inside, lanterns flickered on the walls, throwing crooked shadows across the floor. The silence was thick, broken only by the steady drip of water into a basin. As she scrubbed, her mind replayed Ruth's screams. She saw the hollowness in the girl's eyes, the way her body seemed smaller afterward. Sarah's stomach twisted, but she kept her hands moving, her face expressionless. That was survival. Obedience on the outside, fire hidden deep within. But then something strange happened. That night, there were no footsteps behind her, no barked commands, no drunken laughter, just silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the skin, that made her heartbeat echo louder in her ears. She paused, hands gripping the wet cloth, listening. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. For a moment, Sarah felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was in that silence that a thought came, sharp and dangerous. Perhaps this place, meant to break her, could become something else. A doorway. An escape. When she finally left the bathhouse, her body trembled with exhaustion. But something inside her had shifted. The slaves whispered later of that night the way the bathhouse had gone eerily still, as if swallowing sound. Some called it an omen. Others avoided the subject altogether, too fearful to name it. But for Sarah, the silence was not fear. It was possibility. She did not know how yet, but deep in her chest, the ember flared. One day, the bathhouse would not be the place of her breaking, it would be the place of her vanishing. The summer heat bore down like a curse. The cane fields shimmered in waves of light, each stalk sharp as a blade, each row a gauntlet of sweat and blood. Overseer Harlan rode through it all with a smirk, whip coiled in his hand, his eyes searching not for labor done, but for the slightest crack in a slave's will. Sarah knew he watched her. His gaze followed her movements, lingered on her face when she bent to cut, on her back when she strained to carry. He wanted her broken. He wanted her on her knees. She could feel his hunger for it, the way one feels the press of a snake slithering close in the dark. That day, Harlan singled her out. "You," he barked, pointing with his whip. "Load another cart." "The men ain't fast enough." The others paused, hands tightening around machetes, eyes flicking toward Sarah with pity. It was men's work stacking stalks in the blazing sun until backs gave out. Sarah's arms burned already from the day's cutting, but she stepped forward without protest. To refuse was worse than the labor. She lifted cane stalk after cane stalk, her muscles trembling, her breath ragged. Sweat stung her eyes. Harlan circled on his horse, amused. "Faster," he taunted. "Show them how strong you are." Sarah did not answer. She gritted her teeth, forced her body to move. Each stalk slammed into the cart with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in her chest. She knew he was waiting for her to falter, to drop to her knees, to beg for mercy, but she did not. When at last the cart was full, she stood, shoulders heaving, dress soaked with sweat and streaked with dirt. She turned to meet his gaze, and for the briefest moment, her eyes locked with his, steady and unflinching. Something passed between them, something dangerous. Harlan's smirk twisted. He lashed the whip against the dirt, the cracks splitting the air. "You'll pay for that look," he hissed, low enough that only she heard. That night, the quarters buzzed with whispers. Word had spread. Colonel Whitmore was losing badly at his games. Cards had taken most of his coin, and debts weighed heavy on his shoulders. He had already sold the slaves the week before, brothers torn from their mother's arms, carted away in chains to pay a planter from Mississippi. The mother had screamed until her throat bled, then sat in silence for days, her eyes vacant. Fear rippled through the quarters. Every family clung tighter, every mother pulled children to her chest at night. No one knew who would be next. Moses shook his head by the firelight, his voice gravelly. "That man's greed gone, eat us alive. We ain't nothin' but cards to him." "Cards and chips?" Sarah sat beside Ruth, the girl's head against her shoulder. She listened, silent, her jaw tight. Cards, chips, that was what they were to Whitmore. But what they were to Harlan was different. He wanted obedience. He wanted her fire snuffed out, and that Sarah knew she could not give. The night air was thick with the drone of cicadas. Beyond the quarters, laughter rose from the big house again, drunken and cruel. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She felt Ruth's small hand gripping hers, trembling. Tomorrow would bring more heat, more labor, more games of power and humiliation. Harlan's threat lingered like the sting of the whip. Whitmore's debts shadowed every family on the estate. But Sarah's silence, her refusal to beg, had lit something, not just in herself, but in others. She had seen it in their faces, in the way they looked at her when she bore Harlan's cruelty without breaking. It was dangerous, because one act of defiance could spark another, and Harlan, with his whip and his smirk, seemed determined to fan that spark into flame. The cane fields stretched endlessly under the burning Louisiana sun, their green stalks whispering like a restless sea. Every step between the rows was a step through blood and sweat. For each stalk bore the weight of broken backs and bruised hands. Sarah worked among them, machete flashing, the rhythm of her labor sharp and relentless. Yet inside her chest, something else burned hotter than the sun. The quarter had grown restless. Whitmore's debts had driven him to the auction block once more, and this time it was Ruth's mother. Sarah watched in silence as the woman was dragged away, screaming, her arms clawing at the air for her daughter. Ruth fainted, her body crumpling like cloth. The men in the quarter stared at the ground, unable to meet each other's eyes. Each loss hollowed them, but also filled them with something they could not yet name. That night, whispers traveled through the huts like sparks on dry tinder. Moses spoke low, his voice carrying both warning and fire. A man can gamble with cards, but not with lives. One day, he'd gone draw the wrong hand. Eyes shifted towards Sarah. She had become a quiet center, a figure who endured and yet did not bow. Ruth clung to her, as if Sarah alone held the strength to shield her. Others began to follow Sarah's steadiness, sensing that her silence was not submission but resistance, something dangerous. Unspoken, but alive. Harlan noticed too. His cruelty sharpened. He made Sarah carry loads twice her weight, ordered her to cut until her hands bled, whipped her for imagined slights. Each crack of leather sang through the cane fields meant not only for her, but for every soul watching. Yet the more he punished, the more the eyes of the enslaved turned toward her, not in pity, but in something close to reverence. Then came the night of the fire. It began with the smell, sharp, acrid, twisting in the wind. Sarah was jolted awake by shouts, by the glow outside the quarters. The cane fields were burning. Flames licked upward, hungry, fierce, consuming the dry stalks in great walls of red and orange. Overseers scrambled with buckets, voices breaking with panic. No one knew who had said it. Perhaps it was accident. Perhaps not. But the slaves watched in silence, their faces lit by the blaze, their eyes reflecting both terror and something else. Hope. The fire roared like a beast unchained, and for one night, the plantation's order burned with it. Colonel Whitmore staggered into the night in his nightshirt, cursing, his face red with rage and drink. He shouted orders, but the wind carried his words away. His wealth, his crop, his empire, all of it threatened by a single spark. Sarah stood at the edge of the quarters. Ruth pressed to her side. She did not move. She did not speak. The fire mirrored the heat in her chest, the same heat that had been building since the bathhouse. Since Harlan's threats, since the first crack of the whip by dawn, much of the field was gone, reduced to ash and smoke. Overseers barked accusations, dragging men forward, demanding confessions. None spoke. The fire was a warning. Something was coming. And Sarah, whether she willed it or not, was at its center. Asterisk, the fire had blackened the cane, leaving only charred stalks that broke underfoot. But though the flames were gone, the fear remained. Colonel Whitmore's rage was unmatched. He struck the overseers, cursed the slaves, swore that someone among them had dared to defy him, and all eyes turned toward Sarah. She had become too steady, too unbroken. Harlan spoke her name in the colonel's ear, his words dripping venom. She's the one. Always glaring, never bending. Fire in her eyes, same as the fire in them fields. That evening, Whitmore ordered Sarah to the bathhouse. It was a place of shame for the women, a place where their bodies were scrubbed and inspected like livestock, where overseers leered under the guise of cleanliness. Sarah walked there silently, her wrists trembling, though her face betrayed nothing. Ruth clung to her before she left, whispering, "Don't go. Miss Sarah, don't go." Sarah pressed a hand to the girl's cheek, steadying her. "Hush now. Whatever happened, you remember you've still got fight in you." Inside the bathhouse, the air was heavy with the smell of soap and mildew. Lanterns flickered along the walls, casting wavering shadows. Harlan stood waiting, whip coiled at his side, grin fixed like a scar. Two other overseers lingered, their laughter low and cruel. They forced Sarah into the water. The wooden tub creaked as she lowered herself in, her body aching, her mind whirling. She thought of Ruth's trembling hand, of Moses' weary eyes, of her mother's voice in the memory of her childhood before chains. Harlan leaned down, his breath hot on her face. "You ain't stronger than me. You gone break tonight? And when you do, every last one of 'em gone see." But Sarah did not answer. Hours passed. The laughter of the overseers quieted. The lantern light dimmed. And when morning came, the bathhouse was silent, completely silent. When Ruth crept there at dawn, drawn by fear and hope, she found only wet footprints across the floor. The tub was still, water darkened with dirt and streaks of blood. Harlan's whip lay discarded, its leather torn. The overseers were gone, their beds untouched. Sarah was gone, too vanished as though the bayou itself had swallowed her whole. Word spread like fire through the quarters. Some said she had been killed, her body hidden by Whitmore's men. Others whispered she had fled into the swamp, the bayou spirits shielding her from hounds and chains. By nightfall, Her name was already changing, no longer just Sarah. But Sarah who vanished, Sarah who defied, Sarah who could not be broken. The masters raged. Harlan's absence was never explained. Search parties scoured the bayou but found nothing but mist and tangled roots. The bathhouse stood empty, its silence heavier than screams. And in that silence, the enslaved found something they had been denied for too long. Belief Sarah had vanished, but her defiance remained. The days after Sarah's disappearance were thick with suspicion and rage. Colonel Whitmore unleashed his fury on the quarters, demanding answers no one could give. Men were whipped until their backs split open. Women were dragged into questioning, their cries filling the night. Children were forced to watch. The lesson burned into their young minds. Silence was not protection, but still, no one spoke. Search parties combed the bayou, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the swamp mist. Hounds bayed at shadows, noses pressed to waterlogged earth, but they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace, only silence. The bathhouse stood untouched, its door swaying in the humid wind. A place no slave would enter again, in the quarters. Ruth wept in Sarah's empty corner, clutching a scrap of cloth Sarah had left behind. Moses sat beside her, voice low and steady. They think they took her, but they didn't. Bayou got her now. Bayou, don't give back what it claimed. His words carried weight, and soon whispers grew. Sarah was not dead. She had crossed into the swamp, to freedom war, into something beyond freedom. Among the enslaved, her name became a shield. Overseers barked orders, and someone would murmur, "Remember Sarah." Whips cracked, and in the silence after. Another would whisper, "She's still walking." Out there in the bayou? Each word was a spark, but for Whitmore, Sarah's absence was poison. His debts mounted. Neighbors mocked him for losing not only fields to fire, but slaves to thin air. And Harlan as overseer, his iron hand was gone as well. Vanished the same night as Sarah. Some said the bayou had swallowed him too. His screams still carried on the night wind. Others claimed Sarah had taken him with her, justice in the swamp's dark waters. Whitmore drank more heavily. His gambling grew frantic, his hands shaking as he threw coin after coin on the table. Yet no amount of cards could restore what had slipped away. Sarah's absence had become more powerful than her presence. An open wound he could not close, ghost he could not silence. Seasons turned. Crops faltered. The plantation's wealth thinned like fabric worn bare. But the legend of Sarah thickened, woven into every whispered prayer and every stolen glance at the bayou's edge. Children grew up hearing her name like a lullaby. Women clutched it to their chests as armor. Men carried it in their hearts as defiance. And sometimes, on nights when the mist rolled heavy and the frogs sang loud, a shape was seen moving through the cypress shadow stall, unbowed with eyes that glowed like embers. Sarah of Louisiana. The slave woman who vanished into the bayou after the bathhouse fell silent. She was gone, but she was never forgotten.